Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Colin Camerer. He is the Robert Kirby Professor of Behavioral Finance and Economics at the California Institute of Technology, where he teaches cognitive psychology and economics. His work seeks a better understanding of the psychological and neurobiological basis of decision making in order to determine the validity of models of human economic behavior. In 2013, Dr. Camerer was named the MacArthur Fellow. So, Dr. Camerer, thank you for taking the time to come on the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
My pleasure.
Okay, great. So, in your work, you're very interested in the topic of decision making, and I guess that you try to tackle it from several different perspectives and approaches to really try to understand how human decision making works and then apply it in the context of economics and economic behavior, right? So, the first question I would like to ask you is, what is really decision making, and are there different types of decision making or not?
Yeah, so I take a very general view because from kind of biology up to very complex decision making like voting and legislation and things like that. So I think it's helpful to start at the bottom. So some kinds of things that are decision-like are reflexes. For example, if you hear a loud bang, you'll have a startle reflex. Your body is equipped to, and so the decision there is to activate things in your body and brain to prepare yourself for threat. But it's not a conscious decision. It's very hard to inhibit, right? So I think of it as a decision that's been kind of installed by evolution, almost like a puppet. The puppeteer is making you move. One step up from that is something we refer to as habits, and we use the word habit to mean something very special, which is it's essentially neural autopilot. The idea is that if you made the same decision over and over, and you've been keeping track of the reward, we call reward prediction error, and the reward prediction error is very close to zero, meaning you're getting what you thought you were going to get. Then you may take that decision. And what's special about habits, which makes them almost like reflexes, is that you can do it very subconsciously. We call that implicit, like you're not really sure you're doing it. Like, why do you comb your hair a certain way? Or when you floss your teeth, do you start in a certain part of your mouth? So these are things that are, and they're subconscious on purpose, because the whole point of neural autopilot is to sort of offload what we call executive function or cognitive control and do something automatically. And then kind of the highest in the hierarchy is what we call model directed or sometimes deliberative decision making. So when we think of decision making, that's usually what everyday folks think about, which is I'm using some kind of symbolic system, like I make a spreadsheet of like where to go on vacation, or I print out 3 or 4 different things. And what's model directed about it, the word model and model directed means we have some idea about how different actions will lead to probabilistic outcomes or will lead people to treat a certain way. You can think of it as sometimes we draw it in science as a decision tree. There's a series of steps, or it could be something like a GPS phone app, sat nav, and you're trying to go from here, where I'm sitting in Pasadena, California, to the beach, and the model is that it shows me a bunch of routes on a graph. Mm-hmm. And the difference and deliberative decision making of that kind is usually pretty conscious. It's effortful, meaning if we're doing that, we can't concentrate on other things. Whereas habit is, we can multitask. If we're executing a habit, we can also do lots of other things at the same time. And so we think that's basically the kind of hierarchy of types of decisions. And associated with that, as I mentioned briefly, is the idea that some of the things you might call a decision are really subconscious and rapid and automatic and implicit. Like when we look at a person, we make a snap judgment of something like beauty, friend or foe. Is this person going to hurt me or help me? And we think of those as decisions because the brain circuitry is integrating information for purposes of preparation for action, but we're not always very conscious of what that is. So somebody asked you, why did you smile at that person? You may not even necessarily be able to articulate the answer why. because it's subconscious.
And are all of these types of decision making relevant to understanding economic behavior, or are some of them more important than others?
I think they're all very relevant. So, and the reason is this is a difficult area to understand scientifically, so not everybody agrees with me. But I think there's a bit of a myth that as you deal with more complex, higher level decisions, like higher up in an organization, like a company, or things that are more impactful, like whether to have a baby, what college major to choose, what book to read out of lots of different books, what medical care to seek out. There's a bit of a myth, and this is part of economic theory, that the more important the decision, the more time and resources you spend thinking about what to do. And I don't know if that's always true. In fact, it's almost surely not always true. So I'll give you one simple example, which is Harry Markowitz, who's a Nobel Prize winner in finance, won the Nobel Prize for developing a very particular theory about how you should invest your money into stocks and bonds by taking account the possible risks, like variability of stock returns, and the rewards, like how much you could earn over time. And when he himself decided to invest retirement money, he decided to invest 50% in stocks, 50% in bonds. And he said, the reason is, if I was fully invested in stocks and they went down, I'd be upset. And if I was not invested at all in stocks and they went up, I would be upset. So he was using what we call regret minimization. And this had nothing to do with the theory for which he won a Nobel Prize. And so it was a very heuristic approach. But this is a colossal decision that's very important, right? If you're starting out, at least in the American system, and you have some pension money and you have to decide where to invest it. If you invest, fully in stocks or fully in bonds, 30 or 40 years later, when you retire, the difference could be many millions of dollars. So that's an example. And I think a lot of political decisions, a lot of really impactful decisions also involve a lot of emotions. They involve analogies. They involve what we call reinforcement learning, like I don't want to make the mistake I did last time, or I want to do exactly what I did last time because it worked out so well, even though they're often very small samples of experience. And so I think a lot of the important decisions people make and organizations make often revolve around these very subconscious, almost animal-like decision-making.
So in economics, people talk a lot about the concept of rationality, but I guess that what people mean by rationality in an economic context, and particularly nowadays, is somewhat different from common parlance, let's say, or the way that common people typically use the word. So, I mean, in a modern from a modern economic perspective, and particularly taking into account that we also are influenced by our emotions and things like that, how would you define rationality, or human rationality in this case?
So you're absolutely right. So just to clarify, the way economists use the term is really to denote two slightly different things. One is just consistency. Like if you like chocolate better than vanilla ice cream, better than pistachio, you should choose chocolate when it's available, and so on. But that also involves stability. So you can imagine that, as people learn over time or their tastes change, you may not like eating the same thing twice in a row. But that's okay too. You could have a sort of preference for, say, sequences of things, such that you're alternating or you're not alternating. The other concept of rationality is essentially Bayesian rationality, or kind of statistical rationality, which means given the information available to you, you're making the statistically correct decision. But those concepts of rationality leave a lot of room for behavior that in everyday language, or like in psychiatry, we might think of irrational, right? So somebody may really like pain. They like having pain inflicted on them, a masochist. And as long as they consistently, trade off pain and money, then that could be considered perfectly rational. So in economics, we often use the Latin phrase de gustibus non est disputandum. There's no accounting for taste, or there's no arguing about taste. So economists are quite lenient about what it is that you're consistently preferring. Um, and and that concept of rationality is actually pretty weak, or I should say it's weak in the sense that it doesn't rule out too many different things, right? Like if a person says, I'm going to pay somebody to physically harm me because I like that, then we would say that's perfectly rational if that's what you want. So that conflicts with how people often think about everyday rationality. And also this simple concept of consistency in choice is obeyed by almost every species that's been carefully studied. In other words, if even rats, pigeons, monkeys, if you present choices in a simple way, almost all the animals seem to have a kind of preference for, say, a certain kind of food or for a certain location to nest in, and they'll exhibit fairly consistent preferences in that way.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, nowadays it's a very different concept than the one that came from ideas like, for example, the Homo economicus, right, where it was basically about people being rational in the sense that they would try always to maximize economic payoff or something like that. But then we are also regulated by, for example, what Adam Smith called social sentiments. And we also have an evolved morality and certain predispositions to act with other people with certain social interests in mind, let's say. So, I mean, we have to take all of that into account, right? And the rationality in the way that people thought about it before doesn't really apply, right?
Yeah, so there's two things, which is, so the content of preferences and whether people are maximizing by trying to get what they most like could certainly be, it's kind of sculpted by biology, by socialization in your house, by your parents, by peers when kids are especially in teenage years, and by acculturation, right? Like some cultures find something utterly disgusting, like, eating with your right hand. And others find perfectly normal. So they're fairly deep-seated preferences that can be sort of acculturated into you. And so if you wanted to really understand what people are going to do, the idea of consistency doesn't tell you very much. You'd like to know what's their polygenic, what's their genetic makeup, like what did their parents do? There's a tremendous amount of correlation between parental preferences and children's preferences. Some of that is heritable, meaning we think it's really genetic, and some has to do with socialization and your parents teaching you to like certain things that like they do. And by the way, those intergenerational preferences are all over the place. So it's obviously one of the strongest is something like how tall you are and what you look like. But there are other things that include how often you vote in politics or how liberal and conservative you are. Almost everything has some degree of heritability. So genes play a pretty big role.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, in your work, you try to have a sort of integrative approach to the sort of cognitive mechanisms that operate on decision making, right? So, for example, you try to integrate approaches from cognitive psychology, experimental psychology, economics, neuroscience. Why would you say is it so important for us to try to gather information or data from all these different sources to understand how the cognitive mechanisms that are relevant to economic behavior operate?
So I think that's one of the most important questions you could possibly ask. I think personally, I think it has to do with a certain kind of humility, right? So if an economist were asked, how would you get people to lose weight because obesity is bad and it has a big healthcare cost for society? The constrained optimization framework, in which there's preferences, beliefs, and constraints, only gives you that much leverage. It does seem very general, but it doesn't tell you, for example, if you paid people money to lose weight, would it actually work? It doesn't tell you if you allowed people to make a bet with themselves, like I'm going to put up $1,000 of my own money And if I don't lose enough weight in 3 months, I lose that. Is that going to work? What's the role of social support and trying to impress people? Like somebody who just got divorced and now is ready to date again and find someone to marry might be highly motivated to lose weight. It has nothing to do with money, or not very much to do with money. On the supply side, which means what do firms and governments do that affects, say, obesity and eating, you have to deal with the fact that companies mostly profit by selling you food that you would like to eat. And actually, if you eat it or not, it doesn't really matter. So you may end up with like a lot of food waste. So you have obesity and food waste, even though a lot of the world is hungry. So I think any of these interesting problems, you need to take like every idea, every type of data, and every method for analyzing data you could possibly get. And economics, I think, has been a little bit closed-minded about asking adjacent sciences for help on some very basic things.
Mm-hmm. And would you say that by crossing evidence from the several different sources, we also get a clearer and more solid picture of each specific cognitive mechanism that we want to study?
Yes. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Let me introduce something that might be useful to think about in this way, which is, so David Marr, who's a famous vision scientist, student of Thomas Poggio, has advocated a kind of 3-level framework for thinking about cognitive systems and sort of everything, every scientific system. And he had the top was, I'm not going to use exactly his language, so I hope I don't confuse your viewers, but at the top he had in mind functionality or adaptiveness, like what is a behavior for? Like if somebody becomes obese, why is that? Is it some evolutionary need to eat food? And how did that somehow get off the rails? In the middle is algorithmic, which, as the name indicates, is kind of like if you were going to make a blueprint for a house, but not say exactly how you build the house, just a detailed blueprint. And the blueprint has to match the functionality. Like, what is the house for? Is it supposed to be warm? Or do you need to have a lot of room for guests to visit? Right. So the ideal algorithmic blueprint should implement or respect the functional needs. And then the lowest level, actually the hardest level, is the mechanistic. Like, how exactly do you build this thing? How do you build it? Right. Another example is flight and wings in birds. Like, why do birds have wings? Because they need to fly. Why do they need to fly? Some of it is to migrate. Now, why they migrate is a bit of a mystery, at least to me. And they sometimes need to escape, right, if they're escaping predators, or they are predators, like a peregrine falcon, right? So they fly so they can hunt mice who are on the ground. And the algorithm is essentially like a blueprint. If you were to build a robotic bird, what are the crucial elements you'd have that would enable it to fly? And then the mechanism is, how exactly do these wings move, and how can this creature that's heavy float up in the air for maybe for hours and hours at a time, or for months and months of migration? And that has to do with the bones are very light, and feathers for reducing friction, and so on. And so going back to human beings, when we think about something like decision making, I think it's really imperative to think about the functionality. What is it for? Let's go back to habit. Like, why would you have a habit that would make us do something automatically? And we might even keep doing it when it's kind of a mistake because things have changed. And the answer is neural autopilot. It saves executive function. Algorithmically, what does habit look like? And so we have a series of equations that basically say, a habit is when you walk into a situation like, what am I going to have for lunch? You think, what did I have last time? Was it reliably rewarding? That is, was the gap between what I expected and what I got close to zero? And if so, buy the same thing. And then mechanistically, how does the brain actually implement that? Is it in ventral striatum? Does it use very few cognitive resources? Is there a direct line from like sensory perception to memory to the motor system to take an action? And I think social sciences need to respect all 3 levels, partly because humans are biological organisms, and systems of humans are not exactly biological organisms, but you don't really understand the system without understanding the person better. And part of that is the interaction between people, how people communicate with language, and who is friend and foe, and so forth. And I think economics, in some respects, chose something like physics as sort of the model science. Like, a lot of economics theories are like equations you could fit on one t-shirt. And I think biology is the correct model science. And biology respects this mechanism, algorithmic functionality hierarchy.
Yeah. So let me just ask you now a more targeted follow-up question, specifically about neuroscience. So let's say that we understand completely the function that a particular cognitive mechanism serves, that we understand how it works, that is the kinds of inputs that it processes. In this case, probably it's mostly about inputs that we get from our social environment and things like that, and how it processes that kind of information, and then the behavioral outputs that it generates. I mean, that we understand completely how it works. So after that, what do we need the neuroscientific bit for? What kind of insights can we get from that?
I think that neuroscience is helpful for a bunch of things which are very fundamental. One is individual differences, right? So when people behave differently, we often think of traits, like, are you somebody who gets afraid very easily? And so you can fill out a form that says, I get afraid very easily, or you can show people pictures. And fundamentally, differences in people are going to have to do with neural circuitry, both anatomical, as expressed by genes, and then functional circuitry, what areas of the brain respond to certain things. So it may be that people who are not very fearful have the same amount of fear activation, but they have some kind of prefrontal cortical like override or inhibitor that says, oh, don't be afraid. And other people don't have that degree of inhibition. So that's one thing. The second thing is causality. So the phrase we often use about the brain is, why care about where? Like, we know the brain is doing something, and that determines, who you love, or whether you invest in stocks, or what book you enjoy reading. But why do we care about where in the brain those things are happening? And one reason is because if we know a lot about the circuitry, we can do the absolute greatest thing you can do in science, which is to turn something on and off, right? Like we did a study, for example, in which we were interested in when people are able to resist eating tempting junk foods and choosing healthier foods instead, like yogurt versus a candy bar. And we found activity in dorsolateral prefrontal cortex on the left. You might see it on the right, on the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And that area seemed to be unusually active when people were able to kind of override the temptation to eat candy, and they would pick yogurt instead. And then a later study, a couple of years later, applied a technique called TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, which basically disrupts activity. It's a little bit like a blow to the head or like being sleep deprived. It kind of disrupts activity for a short period of time, like 15 or 20 minutes in a certain area. So that if you disrupted, for example, the facial perception area, you might have trouble recognizing faces of familiar people, just briefly. And so when you apply TMS to this area, and people were choosing not snack foods, but choosing between money amounts now or larger money amounts in the future, they become more impatient. It's as if they couldn't imagine the future money. And so that means you can actually control how people compare current and future rewards if you know what part of the brain to disrupt in this particular way. And that could lead to actual machinery. For example, hundreds of thousands of people around the world have electrodes implanted into a particular part of the brain and basal ganglia to treat Parkinson's disease, called deep brain stimulation. And that's because we know, after decades of research on Parkinson's disease and on animals, we know a lot about what Parkinson's disease, how it works mechanistically. So if you want to kind of cure Parkinson's disease, the best way currently for extreme cases seems to be this deep brain stimulation. And I think in economics, there'll be some analogies to that kind of thing, where we want to be able to understand what brain circuitry leads us to, say, not value the future correctly, or to why is it so hard for us to imagine things like that like I don't exercise enough. And it's partly when I do exercise, like I go to the gym or go for a strenuous hike, it feels great because there are endorphins and virtue, and I can brag to people. And how come I don't have those feelings now when I'm making a decision, right? So if we understand more about the circuitry of things like that, what's sometimes called this prospective imagination or prospective memory, we might be able to use either physical methods or certain kinds of training to see if we can get people to make better decisions.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let me just ask you this now, still about neuroscience, because as you know, there are many criticisms nowadays that people put forth against at least some of the literature in neuroscience. They say, for example, that it's only correlational, particularly referring to one of the most used techniques, that is fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging. I mean, they say that it's only correlational, that it's basically statistical, that they also say that because there's a time lag between performing, for example, a certain action and activation in the brain, that it's hard to interpret what's really going on there, and that perhaps it's not a good enough level of analysis because we are not really able to understand what's going on at, for example, the cellular and the molecular level through that approach. So I would like to ask you, do you agree with at least some of these criticisms or limitations? And if so, what do you think that at the current level of development are the conclusions that we can extract from neuroscientific studies?
Yeah, that's a very sensible question. So I'm very optimistic because I think it helps to distinguish between what we're sure about right now based on previous science and what we think we can come to be more sure about in 5 years or 25 years or 100 years. And a lot of the criticisms about science are criticisms about what do we know right now. They're not so much criticisms about if we did things differently and better in the next 10 years, would we learn a lot more quickly? And on that part, I'm just extremely optimistic. So back to fMRI. It is true that fMRI has a number of limits. It's expensive because the machines are expensive. It's claustrophobic. It's not normal to lie on your back in a machine, with your head kind of restrained so you don't move around too much. And it's also very loud, like boom, 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 like standing outside a nightclub. And like if you want to study claustrophobia, you cannot study claustrophobia using fMRI because claustrophobic people will not want to go inside. And as you mentioned, also it has poor temporal resolution, right? So a lot of things that may be happening in the brain in less than 1 second, you're not going to pick up for a couple of seconds. But every technique in neuroscience has one or two great virtues and then a lot of limits. So fMRI, the limit is expensive, claustrophobic. You can't study people for too long because the magnets get hot and people get tired. You can't study like sleep in fMRI very effectively. If you want to study a full sleep cycle, like 7 or 8 hours, but it covers the whole brain. And so if you're interested in all brain circuitry, which is kind of human neocortex, like kind of a thinking cap, and then basal ganglia and subcortical, fMRI is very good for that. Mm-hmm. The second thing is almost all these techniques in neuroscience are what we call in economics complements, which means suppose you find out from fMRI, because we looked at the whole brain, that DLPFC seems to be important in maintaining a kind of concept of the health value of food and helping us resist temptation. That's what we found in a study in 2008 in Science. Once you found that, even though the time course of that was very slow, right? You look at a candy bar or you look at a yogurt, and a couple seconds later we see blood flow into this region. If you're interested in learning more, we could then use EEG. And so EEG, the disadvantage is it basically just picks up weak signals on the cortical surface. But if we've found DLPFC, which is near the cortical surface, and we want to know what happens in the 2 seconds during fMRI, the fMRI just looks like that. What happens what do people like immediately get tempted in the first 200 milliseconds? And then there's a kind of inhibitory willpower, like, wait a minute, that happens slower. Is it the other way around? Is there willpower? And then over time, people say, oh, but it looks so good. What's the time course of this process? How can we unpack 2 seconds? And you could do it with EEG. EEG records essentially every millisecond. But it doesn't have such good spatial resolution. We can't be quite as sure what part of the brain you're seeing, so we have to use a lot of statistical tricks. And so I think one of the superpowers of neuroscience is that, the flaw in one method, like fMRI is too slow, can easily be repaired by the virtue of a different method, like EEG, which is very fast, but spatially not very good. And so the trick is to kind of combine these things. It's a little bit like a crossword puzzle. You have a couple letters here, and that helps you figure out this word. And is to combine these things so you get a sort of a good picture of what's happening. And the same with things like, say, animal research versus human research, right? Animals and humans share a lot of neural circuitry, and there's a lot of evolutionary, it's called evolutionary conserve. There's a lot of things that animals do and that we do very, very similar, sometimes vision and things like that. And so we can learn a lot about human behavior from animal behavior for those things for which there seems to be very close behavioral analogies.
Mm-hmm. And also there's the issue with ethical considerations, because, for example, in the history of neuroscience, there was a lot of knowledge that we obtained from some decades ago, where some people went through particular surgical interventions, like, for example, lobotomies and things like that, and that nowadays we probably no longer perform or don't perform routinely as before. And so, those were more direct, even though invasive approaches, but that have a lot of ethical problems behind them, and that we can perform on animal models but not humans, and so that's another limitation, right?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So there are a lot of and obviously people have different viewpoints about animal research as well, about ethics of studying. For example, in the U.S., I think we're very soon, or maybe have already, essentially banned scientific research with chimpanzees on the grounds. It's already the case, for example, that you're not allowed to surgically implant electrodes like you can do with mice and other species in chimpanzees, on the grounds that they're just too much like us genetically. They're like our cousins. And if you can't do it with humans, you can't do it for other species. So I think in general, I think partly because of abuses in the past in general about human subject research, at least in America, people are pretty cautious about not doing things that are even close to this kind of an ethical boundary. There may be other countries in which things are tolerated in a certain way, and that's unfortunate. And it's related to other big ethical questions that have kind of like rushed up more quickly than we've had a chance to really, as societies, think about them, like cloning, genetics, and so forth. And I do think that a lot of smart, thoughtful, well-read people who've thought a lot about the historical examples, like you mentioned, are thinking about neuroethics. Like, what are the limits of not just what we can do to a person if they volunteer, but what neural data are your neural data like your genes, or are there things that we should be protecting, like we do with medical records? In the U.S., we have something called HIPAA, and a lot of people are thinking carefully about what to do. I think in the case of genetics and CRISPR and genetic modification, the teams of scientists and ethicists have come together pretty rapidly to establish a kind of norm of, this is what we shouldn't do ever, and here's why, and this is what is okay. Usually that process is slow. The science is almost races ahead of ethics, but we have some recent successes, again, involving genetic work that are kind of a role model of, like, here's how you can have a community of people with very different opinions and know-how. Sometimes it's scientists, philosophers, people interested in law, to kind of come to an agreement on something. It's hard work. You need to get a lot of people in a room for periods of time and organize this process of consensus formation. But there have been some successes, so I'm optimistic about that.
Mm-hmm. So shifting topics now, and because we're focusing mostly on the theoretical side of things today, let me just ask you, in terms of lab experiments with economic games, for example, because they are done in an artificial environment, I mean, people are not really in a normal social context. Aren't there also limitations with that kind of approach? And I mean, can we reduce those limitations by integrating those kinds of studies with others done in natural environments, like, for example, in field studies?
Yeah, that's a very important question. I think we're making a lot of progress in that direction. I would say it's true that, let's take something simple like the ultimatum game. Okay, so the ultimatum game is a very simple way of thinking about some small part of pro-sociality in which you have $10 given to you, like windfall money. You didn't earn it, because it turns out if you earned it, of course, things are a bit different. So an experimenter says, you have $10, you can share it with Colin. How much? And if he says no, it's too little, nobody gets any money. How much do you give? And this is a kind of artificial thing, because it's pretty rare that you walk down the street and somebody says, "Oh, by the way, you're going through a market," and someone says, "Oh, here's some money. Do you want to share it with a stranger?" Or you find $1 US $1 bills on the floor, and somebody walks next to you, and you think, "Oh, should I give some to this person?" So it's definitely quite artificial, and we do that in science a lot, right? We make something very artificial and weird that doesn't actually exist in everyday life in order to really focus on something very simple, which is, if somebody gave you too little money as you judge it, would you reject it? Mm-hmm. But that's just the start, right? And then the next question is, do we learn something from those experiments that would help us think about reciprocity and pro-sociality in other everyday settings? Like, are there other cases where, when you're bargaining, where you think, this person didn't give me what I wanted, and even though it's going to hurt me a little bit, I'm going to say no, like a strike in between workers and a company. How often are people willing to give up something that they value in order to punish someone they think has been unfair or has violated some kind of sharing norm? And there's quite a lot of evidence where you take people in a lab and you'll measure, say, whether they reject money in an ultimatum game or whether they share money with strangers. And then you correlate that with some other activity that they do that's similar. Like, to the people, a relative of the ultimatum game is called the dictator game. And that you just dictate how much money another person gets, including zero. And it's like the ultimatum game, but the other person cannot reject it. So if you give them too little, they're stuck with it. It's really just one person allocating. And the evidence is that people who allocate more money in the dictator game are a little bit more likely to be charitable in their everyday life. So if you ask them, do you give money to charities? If somebody stopped on the street and asked for directions, would you walk past them, or would you stop and would you donate time instead of money? And the correlations are usually not high, but they're typically positive, like 0.3. So somebody who's gives more money, like gives $2 out of 10 instead of 0 out of 10 to a stranger in the lab, is a little bit more likely to be generous with strangers in the outside world. And by the way, the scientists like me and behavioral economics, we spend a lot of time trying to help answer this question. In other words, doing lab experiments and then parallel field experiments, or asking people, you just did this here, what do you do in your everyday life? And again, I don't think we know enough about that lab and field congruence as I would like to. But a lot of people are studying it, and we're learning more. I see about 10 papers a year that have really nice attempt to match up lab behavior with field behavior and see if they're really different or not.
Mm-hmm. So this might be a tricky question, but in terms of economics, how should we think about the interplay between the individual and the society or the collective? I mean, because of course we are trying to understand how our cognitive mechanisms operate, and those operate at the level of the individual mostly. But then we also have inputs of information from our social environment, and then there are people that have approaches where they try to understand things in terms of emergence, that is how collective behavior emerges from individual minds, and then there are people that are more reductionistic, let's say, and try to go from I mean try to reduce everything simply to what happens in the mind of individual people. So I mean how should we think about that very complicated subject of I mean, if there's a more important side of things here, the individual or the collective, and how they interact with one another?
Um, yeah, that's another very astute, complicated question. I mean, I think there's value in both approaches. So just to be clear for your audience, economists as a kind of tribe are hardcore methodological individualists. What that means is they think of the individual as sort of like a you know a ball, a billiards ball, right? And the interaction of individuals, when individuals interact with each other, nothing about the interactive process affects changes the ball. I mean, it could be that, for example, I care about another person's utility, so I give money because it makes me feel good, because I like feeling good when they get money from me. But it doesn't deeply change, like the balls are not like clay or like viscous, like when they touch each other, they fundamentally change and form a unit, right? Like a household. So some of this is just mathematics, because if in the process of trading things with each other, people really change what they think or how they think about another person, that would make the mathematical analysis of markets, demand and supply, extremely complicated. So so partly there's a convenience to using this methodological assumption. At the same time, I think the idea of emergence is so important and interesting that you know, and I think you can study emergence and methodological individualism kind of at the same time. Like there could be properties, for example, the whole point of a competitive market, without a centralized planner, a competitive market with competition can generate the highest amount of surplus. You can generate the highest value for people trading with one another, and so that's an emergence result, basically. But it maintains the methodological individualism that what we're going to count up is what each people values, and we're going to kind of count those up in some kind of a scale. I think economists have not taken emergence seriously enough in many cases, like revolutions or technology adoption, you know, fashion. You know, there's a lot of things that are important that are like first order major things in the economy, or norms and fashion. Like in the US, smoking has gone down over the years from maybe 40% of people smoking somewhat regularly to 10%. Some of that is just prices. You know, taxes have gone up, and so when prices go up, people do it less. But some of it is social norms. You don't see people smoking on TV and movies. You know, it's not cool. My son is a teenager, he's 13. It's not cool to smoke. When I was a teenager, I didn't smoke, but it was cool to smoke. You know, like the smokers would all hang out together. And so, you know, those are things that are, you can use certain kinds of language economics to describe those things, like norms and interdependent utility functions. But the insights and the examples are more likely to come from, say, sociology and cultural anthropology and fields like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, we've already talked a little bit about this, but in economics you use the word preferences to refer to consistent choices that people make in their lives. I mean, could we also talk about social norms, since we refer to that as social preferences in some way? And if so, how would that translate?
Yeah. So that's a really good example. So when I was at University of Chicago on the faculty in 1992, there was somebody studying norms, and we periodically evaluate people we might want to hire or we might want to promote or give tenure, et cetera. And I remember exactly this discussion that I said, "Oh, this person studies norms," and one of the economists said, "I don't know what that is. What does that word mean?" And I couldn't tell if they were just teasing. They were just being argumentative. But what they meant was, please define for me in economic language what a norm is. And what I recall saying at that time, probably I hadn't thought about it as much as I have since then, 25 years ago, was a norm is a thing that was sort of imported from sociology for the most part, and from anthropology and other fields. And I think it's both a belief and a preference. So we think of a norm like whether you tip somebody in a restaurant in the US, you're supposed to tip 15%. It's both a belief in the sense that I think this is what most people actually do. So it's a belief about that's empirically testable. Like I could do a study and say, ask my friends, do you tip or do you not tip? But it's also a preference. The preference is through what we think of as social image. Like if there's something that I believe other people do, and if I don't do it, they'll think that I'm a certain type of person, like cheap or a rule breaking or mean or weird. And I don't want to be seen as those things. So I have a preference for being seen as a norm obeyer rather than a norm violator. Then that preference will lead me to obey the norm. And then the preferences are going to generate choices, and those are going to kind of support the beliefs. So you can get a kind of what we think of as an equilibrium, which is when the beliefs about what most people do are persistent because most people choose to obey those norms, and the people choosing to obey the norm supports the belief that this is what people do. That view still leaves us a lot of work to do. Like, how do you change a norm, right? So in American schools, for example, people are very concerned more than ever about bullying. When one child says to another one, I don't like you, or I hate you, or you can't sit here with us at lunch. And suppose you wanted to go in and change that norm. If a norm is a belief and a preference for conforming to the belief, what do you do? What do you do? In fact, I was just at a conference where a social psychologist was talking about this, what she talked about was actually domestic violence in Uganda. And turns out that in Uganda, a lot of men, when they get married, think it's okay to hit my wife because that's part of what I'm entitled to do as a husband. And it turns out you can change that. And men also say that's what most husbands do. I don't feel guilty about domestic violence because most husbands do this, and I'm just adhering to a norm. So in that case, there's also norm adherence, but it's a norm which is bad for women and probably bad in many other ways. And I think the answer she discussed was you can change norms, but it's kind of a slow process, and it takes I don't think anybody has a magic recipe for how to do it. But the recipe is not going to come from economics, probably. It's going to come from understanding how cultural norms are established in the first place. How do you change from one norm to another? Probably a lot of it comes through beliefs, right? If you and in anthropology, for example, they have a beautiful concept called prestige bias transmission, which means if somebody who's famous and popular says, don't hit your wife, real men don't hit their wives, and that person is like a basketball player or a politician or a singer, whoever is prestigious, which is partly a function of culture, right? In some societies, it's an older person. In other societies, it's like Britney Spears or Ariana Grande or some younger person, If that prestigious person says, I don't do a certain behavior, that could change beliefs, and then change because if people want to adhere to the belief, the believed or perceived norm, that could change behavior pretty rapidly. So, but that's a theory. That's one theory of how you could get normative change, is by changing beliefs, by kind of hijacking this normal transmission for cultural transmission. But the story I just told you involves three fields: economics, that says norms are beliefs that match preferences because of equilibrium; social psychology, is the person who was giving the talk about Uganda, and cultural anthropology, which uses the idea of prestige bias transmission. And I think when you mix, just take whatever you can get from whatever sciences that are interesting and that have a lot of evidence and that have some nice mathematical structure, and that's how we're going to be able to think about things like pro-social norms. And by the way, economics is kind of a very faddish discipline. So when I, in 1992, when I was talking at the University of Chicago about norms, and no one quite knew what I meant, not no one, but one economist wanted me to articulate, in economic language, tell me how you would translate the word norm into our dictionary of words. And now somehow norms have become very popular and of great interest in economics. So economists have sort of discovered norms in the way that that Christopher Columbus discovered America.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so since you use the word belief, let me just ask you this. What are beliefs exactly? Because when people think about beliefs, they usually think about something that is conscious and that we thought about and that we have in some way or another rationalized. Like, for example, I believe in X, I believe in Y, I have this ethical system that I thought about for a very long time, and these are the kinds of moral norms that are behind my behavior or regulate my behavior. So do beliefs need to be in any way explicit or conscious?
No. So in fact, one idea from economics that also has gained some traction in other fields is the idea that Jimmy Savage had this idea of what he called personal probability. And the idea was that there's states of the world, there's things that may occur that are either happening right now or they may occur in the future, like a presidential election or climate change. And in his view, what having a belief meant being willing to bet on what would happen in the future. And Annie Duke, who's was an extremely successful poker player and also is kind of a semi-professional social scientist, has a book called Thinking in Bets. And the whole point of the book is, if somebody says, oh, I believe such and such is true, or oh, I don't think that's going to actually happen, one way to kind of really hold their feet to the fire is to say, are you willing to bet on that? Are you willing to bet on that? And so it could be that a lot of our beliefs really are very subconscious or implicit. And now when you ask people to bet, you force them to kind of think about, how deeply held is my belief and sort of why do I believe this and so forth. But certainly lots of beliefs about, and a lot of cultural beliefs about, say, religion and what's morally proper, seem to be things that are different than beliefs about who's going to win a sporting event, or whether it's going to be raining tomorrow. Things in which you can think of a physical system that could be analyzed, or maybe you could look statistically at past patterns. And so these very personal, subjective beliefs probably are of very different quality and probably very different brain processes.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I also asked you that because there are people, particularly in game theory, for example, that they say we don't even need for example, ideas that are transmitted between people to understand how social norms change, how fashion trends change and things like that, that we only need to understand the social dynamics, like, for example, the social incentives that are operating on a given society, and then, the things that people say, the way they explain their own behavior, their own tastes and preferences, that those are mostly post hoc rationalization, and we don't need to pay that much attention to that to understand how those kinds of things operate. So
it is true that this idea pops up in lots of different places, like actions speak louder than words, or watch what people do, not what they say. And I think what people say is pretty important. And by the way, humans lots of other species use language, like songbirds and non-human animals, but language is one of the secrets of our success, like Joe Henrich talks about in his anthropology book. So, talking to one another isn't just mindless kind of cheap talk. I mean, it actually facilitates action. It conveys deep felt emotions and resolves conflict. But with that said, it is true that oftentimes people either aren't sure why they're actually doing something, and so it comes out of their mouth as sort of like a publicist, explaining away behavior, or they just don't really, or there's a social desirability. Like, I don't want to tell you, at the end of a date, a guy says, "Oh, I'd love to see you again. You're so beautiful. Can I have a second date?" And the girl says, "Well, I'm going to be so busy at work for the next 10 years." So the language people use may not be really truthful, either because we're not really sure why we like certain things or why we want to do certain things, or because we're trying to keep from hurting somebody's feelings, or something like that. So I do think that, ignoring language entirely is a big mistake, because it's a very important thing and it serves an adaptive function. And what people say does have information, but sometimes it's either deliberately misleading or it's sort of meant to protect you from feeling bad about yourself, like at the end of a date, or people just don't really know.
Mm-hmm. Could it be also that maybe it's not the content itself of what people transmit to one another that is relevant, but maybe some information or cues that people subconsciously pick from that information that is transmitted, that then is processed by their cognitive systems, that then produces the behavior? I mean, do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah,
it's a
of
bit
course.
tricky,
Yeah.
But...
Yeah. No, that's right. Certainly, I mean, for example, if you type out a sentence in an email, you're erasing a lot of information that would come if you said the same sentence across Skype or face-to-face with somebody. And this has been a big challenge for language recognition. So a classic case is sarcasm. So you might type in an email, "Oh, that was a really good movie." But if I said it to you verbally, so I'm using my tone of voice and my pitch and pauses and cadence, I might say, "Oh, that was a really good movie." That's totally different than, "Oh, that was a really good movie," right? They're exactly the opposite meanings. And so human language has these extra dimensions to it. And what that just means is that, when you translate from one medium to another, like you go from face-to-face language where we're used to using, facial images, conversational turn-taking, tone of voice, and if you strip all those things away from the file, and now you have just a sequence of words, we've taken a lot of information out.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let me just ask you about one last topic, and this will be a very specific one. Let's talk a little bit about risky gamble and risky behavior, for example, in the stock market, because these are things that are very impactful in society. So, could you tell us first what risky gamble is about from an economic perspective?
So the simplest definition of risk is variability, mm-hmm. right? So if I invest in bonds, for example, I'm pretty sure how much they're going to be worth next year, because the interest rates don't fluctuate very much. If I invest in stocks, there's much higher variability. This is just an historical fact. And it also has to do with how stocks and bonds work in terms of corporate finance and governance and things like that. Basically, the debt holders get paid first if a firm is struggling, and the stockholders have to wait, and so that creates the risk. In finance and most of economics, we essentially assume that risk boils down to variability. So in a statistical distribution, the mean is sort of the average or the center of a distribution of, say, possible stock market outcomes. The variance is a particular equation. You take each outcome minus the mean, square it, average that, blah, blah, blah. However, I think that's of limited use for two reasons. One is loss aversion, and the other is emotion. So when you ask everyday people about risk, they often don't say it's variance. It's whether things can go up a lot or it might go down a lot. What they say is, I'm more focused on loss. Risk is the chance that I'll lose my money. Now, that's a kind of a weird heuristic, because if you're focused only on the chance you'll lose money, there may be a lot of upside potential. and two gambles which have the equal loss probability, one might have a little slightly higher loss probability, but it has a terrific gain probability. Mm-hmm. So most theories assume people are looking at the average gain, and the average is good, variance is bad, and there's something called skewness, which is interesting too, which I'll skip. Another concept is due to George Lowenstein, my collaborator, and Elke Weber and Chris Shee, is called risk as feelings. And the idea is that what risk is, now we get into the brain, when people say this is risky, what they mean is activity in a certain brain circuit, particularly insular cortex, which is an area that's involved in a lot of bodily discomfort, like something smells bad or something makes us afraid or pain, right? That when I say this feels risky to me, what I mean is this area is activating a signal. Now, it is true that a few studies have shown that if you present people with gambles that have different amounts of financial variance, like you could lose a lot or win a lot, that the bigger variance activates insular cortex. So it could well be that variance does generate this kind of negative emotion or concern. But it's also true, it looks like that loss plays a very special role. So loss aversion refers to the fact that obviously people are averse to loss. It refers to the fact that people are unusually averse to losing relative to some point of reference than they are to gaining. And we think that the ratio of loss disutility to gained utility, controlling for the size of the outcomes, is probably like 1.5 or 2 times as big. And so that in the standard economic account of variance doesn't include this loss aversion piece. So it's missing a kind of important part of why, when people say, oh, this is really risky, I might lose, it's the variability is part of the story and the loss aversion is part of the story.
Mm-hmm. So, what are the factors behind risky gamble? What are the things that lead people to this kind of behavior? And then even at the level of, for example, the stock market, where there are really big things at stake. So why does this happen?
I think there are two ingredients that generate a lot of risk-taking. One is optimism, and a second is called a taste for skewness. Okay, so if you have a distribution of things like stock returns, skewness means that it's lopsided, right? So if you go to the racetrack and you bet on a horse at Santa Anita that's 20 to 1, that means if you bet $1 and the horse wins, you get $20. Mm-hmm. So most of the time you're going to lose your dollar, and a smaller percentage of the time you're going to win 20. So when you compute the so-called skewness of the distribution, which is the third moment, it has positive skewness. People love skewness. And so even across species, there's not too many studies across species about skewness, but certain animal species, like when monkeys are performing some kind of simple action in order to get juice rewards, they often like either getting 0 or 4 milliliters more than like getting 2 millimeters for sure. And so the average is the same, 0 and 4, 50-50 chance. The average is expected value is 2, or they could have 2 for sure. They like the gambling. They like to gamble like small scale. But so different species seem to have slightly different tastes for variance, for variance. But everyone loves skewness, and everyone means all animals that have been studied carefully. And I think it's a combination of psychophysics of very high and very low outcomes, like what's the most I could win, what's the most I could lose. That often that calculation doesn't include likelihood, like the probability of winning. So we may be not computing the probability correctly. We're just not doing the math right. And the other may be something like optimism bias. So when we see a horse walking out of the racetrack and it says 20 to 1, our brains think, wow, these horses all look the same. This horse has to have a chance of winning. 5% chance of winning, well, it's probably a little bit higher than that. So we may not be biologically computing the odds correctly. And the great thing about skewness that's so interesting is you can see it in laboratory experiments pretty easily. You can see it in the stock market. So Nick Barbaras at Yale and others have some beautiful analysis of this. And there are stocks that they call lottery stocks, which have the property that there's a small chance of a really big return. Usually it's stocks that, like biomedical companies or drug companies, like if they have a breakthrough drug, there's a huge gain, right? As opposed to like a bank or something like that. So there's positive skewness, or like in entertainment, if studios make 20 movies a year, and if one is a huge hit, like Frozen 2 that just came out, they have an extremely good year. So there's certain businesses that just seem to have this upside potential, breakaway potential. And it turns out people like these lottery sticks so much that they're willing to accept lower average return in order to get skewness. And you also see it, I think, in the venture capital sector, which is essentially completely built on the taste for skewness. So the fact that when companies are really uncertain and they're starting out, who knows what's going to be the next billion-dollar unicorn company. And so, and often really wealthy investors, angel investors are like around $1 million, or other venture capitalists or sovereign wealth funds like in countries are often willing to put millions and millions of dollars into these. These are really risky because most of them are going to just disappear and you lose all your money. But you're buying a giant expensive lottery ticket because there's a small chance that it will be a 10 or 50 or $100 billion company, the next Google or the next Uber or the next what have you. And so this taste for skewness is not just people, betting $5 at a racetrack, or animals, preferring to press a lever and they may get 12 milliliters of juice. You see it at kind of every scale of the economy.
Mm-hmm. So my last question would be, do you know of any solutions for us to, for example, change anything in the environment where people make this kind of risky behavior in the stock market and things related to speculative price bubbles and things like that? I mean, something that we could change that would lead people away from that kind of pernicious behavior that then leads to economic crisis and then have very negative social, political, and other types of consequences.
The best cure seems to be having one bad experience, right? Like going through the great financial crisis in 2008. I mean, there were a lot of causes and moving parts in the financial crisis, but after something like that happens, people take stock, and probably it won't happen again for a few years. But unfortunately, there's an antidote to the cure, which is of experience, which is amnesia and forgetting. So, a lot of people trading in markets now, like young traders in London and New York and different capitals where trading takes place, didn't suffer through the great financial crisis in 2008 in the same way. So I think bubbles and optimism are pretty pernicious. We did do one neuroscientific study where we had people trade an artificial stock. So the value of the stock was created by us. Like if you hold the stock, you get some money, or you could trade it. And so we see what prices they trade at with each other. And we did observe bubbles where, the fair value of the stock and the value was going to go down to, at the end of the experiment, people were trading at 2 or 3 or 4 times the fair value. And we saw activity in nucleus accumbens, which is part of a sort of reward circuitry, and in insula cortex, so nucleus accumbens kind of predicted the rise of the bubble, and in insula, the crash. This was a paper in PNAS around 2015. And that suggests a possible way in, which is if you can make people a little bit fearful during the increase in the bubble, then some of those people who may be tempted to invest in the bubble thinking, I know this is crazy, but I'm going to make a whole bunch of money on the way up and I'll sell before the crash. Like if you can get those people out of the system, or make them feel more cautious, that may kind of limit the heights to which bubbles go. But these bubbles particularly are really fascinating because there are a number of historical examples like the South Sea bubble, tulip bulbs in Holland, and we may be living now through the golden age of bubbles, because even though people are in some ways much more sophisticated about valuation, there's also a lot of incentives to create like new innovations and new technology, and it's very difficult to value. It's hard to know. There's a company, WeWork, that you may have read about and others may have heard about, and their business was basically having commercial real estate and renting out office space to people in a somewhat different way. And a lot of people were skeptical and said, this is not a dramatic new breakthrough. This is not like inventing the iPad, or like Google harnessing all the world's information through search engines, or like Facebook's ad policies. Like anybody could replicate this, just buying a bunch of office space and doing the same thing, maybe even better. But the person who ran WeWork was very charismatic. A lot of wealthy people put money into it, and when those people put money in, other people said, "Well, so and so is investing in WeWork, so XYZ company invested. They're very conservative, and we should do what they do." And so the ability to create even bigger and bigger bubbles based on fairly weak fundamentals, as they say in finance, is greater than ever before. I'll say one good thing about bubbles, which is one view which I kind of hold, is that the existence of these bubbles where companies attract many millions of dollars of financing and then just implode because they can't really do what they hope to do, or they can't do it profitably. It does create an environment in which really brilliant companies that may normally not have been funded in like an old-fashioned system before the rise of venture capital do get funded. So a lot of really amazing companies, Amazon, Google, Apple, particularly Amazon and Google, I think, had early rounds of funding in order to build something that was really, really complicated to build and which had a dramatic change in our world. So, it's just hard to know today whether a new company is going to be, the Ricardo Corporation is going to be the next Google, or it's going to be the next WeWork, or what. And the fact that it's hard to tell, and people like Skewness, and there's a lot of salesmen telling you, we're the next Google, we're the next Google, we're not the next WeWork, is part of what fuels the whole system. Mm-hmm. But it is one roundabout way to get really wild ideas well-funded early on to see what really works. And some of them, have had dramatic changes and improving efficiency in the world economy.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Dr. Camerer, we are reaching our time limit. It has been a very fascinating conversation. Just before we go, what are the best places on the internet for people to find your work?
I just worked on my website. Maybe one of the best is actually Google Scholar Citations. So they do a very nice job of automatically, with no help from me or no interference, of kind of keeping track of academic papers. If Colin Camerer is a very unusual name. If you Google Colin Camerer Caltech, you'll pretty quickly be led to papers and things we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So, Dr. Camerer, again, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show, and I really loved the conversation. So, I don't know, maybe someday we could do another one. Thank you.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. This is a great format, and you're an incredibly smart and thorough host. So it was a really fun talking.
Hello everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. So to keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. Any amount, even just $1, would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons and PayPal supporters: Karen Litska, Anne Blanchett, Perel Galarson, Lau Guerrero, Chantel Gelinas, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Brian Rivera, Lucas Stafiniak, Sergio Condriano, Jane Henninen, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, John Connors, Adam Castle, Vega Guidi, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, David Diaz, Annie Ancata, Jacob Klinkby, Dr. Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, and Bo Weingart, my three producers, Izar Webber, Rosie, and Jim Frank, and my executive producer, Mikhail Ruzieski. Thank you for all.